Chuck Norris pushed open the heavy glass door of La Belle Étoile, Hollywood's current restaurant, with the casual ease of a man who had kicked down doors in 5 different countries. Yet as he entered, the sparkling chandeliers and murmured conversations seemed to pause, just for a heartbeat, before carrying on as if nothing had happened. Chuck paused at the entrance, the deep lines on his face illuminated by the soft golden lights. Dressed in a worn leather jacket, faded jeans, and boots that had seen more battles than most men ever would, he was out of place in a sea of sharp suits, designer dresses, and $2,000 sneakers. The young hostess barely glanced up from her podium, her fingers still tapping frantically on her phone. "Reservation?" she asked in a clipped tone, not even offering a smile. Chuck shook his head politely. "No reservation. Was hoping you had an open table," he said, his voice low and steady. The hostess finally looked up, her perfectly sculpted eyebrows lifting in clear disdain. Her eyes scanned him up and down, taking in every scuff, every wrinkle. Chuck Norris, the legend, the man who had once been the toughest name in Hollywood, might as well have been invisible. "We're fully booked," she said, the words flat and rehearsed. She tapped something onto her iPad, already dismissing him. Chuck offered a polite nod and moved to the side, standing quietly against the polished wall. He wasn't want to make a fuss. Maybe his seat would open up. Maybe someone would recognize him. Around him, the restaurant buzzed with energy. Waiters in crisp black uniforms zipped past, trays balanced on their fingertips. At the bar, influencers with ring lights and designer sunglasses, despite it being 8 o'clock at night, posed dramatically over elaborate cocktails. Nearby, a group of 20-somethings whispered and giggled, their laughter high-pitched and cruel as they pointed at Chuck's boots. "Did someone's grandpa get lost?" one of them said, just loud enough to be heard. Chuck heard it. Of course he did. His hearing was sharper than most half his age, but he let it slide. He had learned, long ago, that the loudest voices were often the weakest. Still, a flicker of sadness crossed his rugged features. The manager appeared, a tall man in a tailored suit that cost more than Chuck's truck. His face wore the polished smile of someone used to schmoozing celebrities. Real celebrities, not has-beens. He glanced at Chuck, frowned subtly, and turned back to schmoozing a TikTok star with 5 million followers and less than 5 functioning brain cells. Chuck waited and waited. People who had come in after him were seated almost immediately. A young man with purple hair and diamond-studded teeth was ushered to a private booth. A couple, both wearing matching outfits and holding tiny dogs, were escorted past Chuck like royalty. No one so much as looked at him. At one point, a waiter carrying a tray of champagne glasses nearly bumped into Chuck and muttered, "Watch it, Pops," without so much as an apology. Another waitress, this one chewing gum and twirling her hair, openly laughed after glancing his way. Chuck remained silent, his hands folded in front of him, his eyes steady and calm. It wasn't just the staff, either. Guests started noticing the out-of-place man leaning against the wall. A woman with a surgically sculpted face made a show of clutching her designer handbag tighter as she passed. A group of young producers whispered loudly enough for Chuck to hear, throwing in phrases like washed-up cowboy and has-been martial artist. One particularly bold influencer, a boy who couldn't have been older than 22, actually approached him. Holding out his phone, he grinned mockingly. "Hey, you mind if I get selfie, dude? My followers love, vintage stuff." He emphasized the word vintage like it was a disease. Chuck looked him square in the eyes for a long, uncomfortable second. The boy wilted slightly under the steady gaze and slunk away without another word. Chuck sighed quietly. He wasn't angry. Not really. Anger was easy. What he felt was heavier, more disappointing. The world had changed. He wasn't expecting adoration, but basic respect shouldn't have been too much to ask. Still, he waited and waited. The clock ticked on. His stomach growled softly, but he ignored it. The leather jacket he wore grew heavier by the minute. The stares became sharper, the whispers crueler. Someone snapped a photo and uploaded it to Instagram with a caption, "Rough night for Clint Eastwood's cousin." No one, not one single soul, recognized him. Chuck Norris, who had once been the most feared and respected man in Hollywood, now stood as an invisible relic in a restaurant that worshipped the next viral moment over legacy. Another hour passed. Chuck shifted his weight from one boot to another, his knees reminding him that they weren't 30 anymore. He debated leaving. He wasn't one to force his presence where it wasn't wanted. But something in him, some stubborn little flame, refused to budge. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was something deeper. Maybe it was the principle of it, that no man deserved to be treated like trash, famous or not. Chuck turned his gaze toward the bar where the manager was laughing uproariously at some joke told by a DJ with more tattoos than teeth. For a fleeting moment, Chuck wondered what would happen if he walked over there and reminded them all just who he was, but that wasn't his way. Violence wasn't the answer. Not tonight. Instead, he stood quietly, strong, silent, steady. The lion inside him stirred, awake and watchful, but leashed. He waited. Somewhere, in the distance, the door opened again, and a gust of cold night air swept through the restaurant. Chuck didn't turn a look. He remained still, unaware that help, unlikely, unexpected, but fierce, was about to walk through the door. And his night, his dignity, and his story were about to change forever. The cold air that rushed into La Belle Étoile wasn't just a gust from the street. It carried a presence with it, a force as undeniable as a hurricane. Gordon Ramsay stormed through the doorway, his face as thunderous as a brewing storm. Dressed in his signature white chef's jacket and dark jeans, he looked every inch the celebrity chef the world knew and feared. Conversations faltered. Heads turned. Even the influencer army paused their endless selfies. The room seemed to shrink around him, everyone shrinking a little smaller, instinctively, under his intense blue-eyed glare. Gordon barely noticed them. His gaze swept across the room like a predator scanning for weakness, and almost immediately, it locked onto Chuck Norris, standing quietly, like some noble monument no one had bothered to honor. Gordon's eyes narrowed. His chef's instincts had always been sharp. He could spot right a mile away, whether it was a spoiled fish or spoiled behavior. He saw the folded jacket over Chuck's arm, the weary but dignified posture, the derisive glances thrown his way by spoiled socialites. He saw the way the staff pointedly ignored the man who, if they had any real sense, should have been carried to the best table in the house like a king. Gordon Ramsay might have been known for yelling in kitchens, but this was a different kind of fury rising in him, a cold, righteous anger. He strode toward Chuck without hesitation, each step ringing on the marble floor like a drumbeat of impending judgment. "Mr. Norris," Gordon said loudly enough for half the restaurant to hear, extending his hand. His voice was warm, genuine, and filled with the kind of respect you couldn't fake. Chuck, surprised, took Gordon's hand, giving it a firm shake. "Mr. Ramsay," Chuck said with a small nod. Pleasure. That one simple interaction, two legends shaking hands, might have ended quietly if Gordon were a different man. But he wasn't. He turned toward the hostess stand, his voice cutting through the clamor like a scalpel. "Excuse me," Gordon barked. The hostess flinched so hard she nearly dropped her tablet. The manager looked up, his smug grin freezing on his face. "Is this how you treat your guests?" Gordon asked, his accent sharpening every word into a weapon. "You leave a living legend standing around like he's waiting for scraps." The room fell into a stunned, heavy silence. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Phones froze in midair. A few people exchanged nervous glances, unsure whether to record or run. The manager stepped forward, his face twisting into something approximating a smile. "Mr. Ramsay, we didn't realize." "Didn't realize what?" Gordon thundered, stepping closer. "Didn't realize you had greatness standing in your restaurant while you were too busy kissing the arses of half-wit influencers." He spun toward the hostess, who visibly shrank. 3 hours ago, this man was laying waste to martial arts tournaments while your parents were still learning how to tie their shoes. He was doing real stunts, fighting real battles, and building a legacy while you lot were playing with finger paints. Chuck, for his part, looked slightly uncomfortable with the attention. He wasn't one for drama. But Gordon Ramsay was a man on a mission now. Gordon pointed at the manager. "Ought to be ashamed of yourself." Then he turned, addressing the entire restaurant, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "All of you, too bloody obsessed with TikTok followers and Botox to recognize real strength, real decency, when it's standing right in front of you." The room sat in stunned, chastened silence. A few of the more self-aware diners shifted awkwardly in their seats. Others, those still blinded by their own arrogance, just looked confused. The manager sputtered, trying to recover. "Of course, Mr. Ramsay. We can seat Mr. Norris right away." "Too late for that," Gordon snapped. His gaze was icy. "You don't deserve to have him in this dump." He turned back to Chuck. "Come on, mate. I know a place that still remembers what respect looks like." Chuck hesitated, but only for a moment. Gordon clapped him firmly on the shoulder, a gesture full of camaraderie and honor. With the entire restaurant watching, some aghast, some secretly cheering, others furiously trying to upload footage to social media, Chuck Norris and Gordon Ramsay walked out side by side, leaving a stunned, shame-faced restaurant behind them. As the heavy doors swung shut behind them, the spell broke. The whispers began. Some people clapped awkwardly. Others fumbled with their phones, already posting captions like, "When Gordon Ramsay defended Chuck Norris, best night ever." But the damage was done. The reputation of La Belle Etoile would never quite recover. Word spread fast in Hollywood, faster than a kitchen fire. That night, nobody cared who wore the best outfit or who had the most followers. The story they remembered, the one they told and retold, was how Gordon Ramsay had walked in, burned the house down with words alone, and left with Chuck Norris like a conquering hero leading his fellow warrior to safety. Outside, in the cool night air, Chuck turned to Gordon with a wry smile. "Appreciate it," he said simply. Gordon shook his head. "No, mate. I should be thanking you. People like you built this town's backbone. They just forgot. Someone needed to remind them." Chuck laughed, a deep, rolling sound. It had been a long time since someone had stood up for him without needing a reason. It felt good. It felt right. Gordon clapped him on the back again. "Come on. There's a little pub I know that serves real food, no selfies required." And together, the two men, legends in their own right, vanished into the night, leaving a trail of shaken egos and a powerful reminder in their wake. Respect isn't given because of fame. It's earned by character, and real recognizes real. The black SUV rumbled smoothly down the winding streets of Los Angeles, the city's neon heartbeat flashing across its windshield. Gordon Ramsay gripped the wheel with one hand, his knuckles white from the residual anger still simmering under his skin. Chuck Norris sat in the passenger seat, the window down just enough to let the cool night air touch his weathered face. Neither man spoke for a while. The silence between them was comfortable, the way it is between warriors who don't need words to understand each other. After about 15 minutes, Gordon turned onto a side street far away from the glittering facades of Hollywood Boulevard. The fancy boutiques and valet stations gave way to mom-and-pop storefronts, neon diner signs, and little bars where the tiles were cracked but the stories ran deep. Chuck looked around, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. This felt more familiar, more real. They pulled up outside a place called Eddie's Grill, a squat building with appealing sign and windows that glowed warmly against the darkness. From inside, the clink of glasses and the low murmur of laughter spilled out into the night. No velvet ropes, no influencers, no pretense. "This place any good?" Chuck asked, raising an eyebrow. Gordon grinned. "Best steak and eggs in the whole bloody city." And more importantly, he paused, looking Chuck dead in the eye, "the kind of place that remembers people like you built the road we're all driving on." Chuck chuckled softly. "Lead the way, chef." They stepped inside, and the shift in atmosphere was instant. Heads turned, but not with judgment, not with mockery. Recognition flashed across the faces of the diners. Genuine, unfiltered respect. The air seemed to change, as if the place itself stood a little taller, because Chuck Norris had just walked through its door. Behind the counter, a stocky man with graying hair and an apron dusted with flour gasped. "Well, I'll be damned," he said loudly, wiping his hands on his apron as he hurried over. "Chuck Norris in my restaurant? Thought today was just another Tuesday." Chuck laughed and shook the man's hand, his grip firm but warm. "Name's Eddie, right?" he said, reading the name stitched into the man's apron. "That's right," Eddie beamed, as if Chuck had just knighted him. "And you, sir, you are more than welcome here." Table shifted. A booth emptied instantly as a young man and his father stood up, practically begging Chuck to take their spot. "It's an honor, Mr. Norris," said the father, his voice cracking slightly. Gordon threw a knowing glance at Chuck, who looked slightly overwhelmed but pleased. Here, there was no arrogance, no judgment, just gratitude. Gratitude for the decades of work, the toughness, the quiet strength that Chuck had carried like a banner for so long. Eddie personally led them to the booth, refusing to let any of the waitstaff handle it. Menus were unnecessary. Before they could even ask, Eddie said, "You're getting the house special." On the house. No arguments. Chuck, who had spent most of his life giving orders rather than taking them, simply smiled and nodded. "Yes, sir." They sat down, and almost immediately, mugs of black coffee were placed in front of them by a teenage waitress whose hands shook a little with nerves. "Big fan, sir," she whispered to Chuck before scampering back to the kitchen. Gordon leaned back against the booth, his posture finally relaxing. "See? This is what I mean. Respect where it bloody belongs." Chuck looked around, taking it all in. A family 2 booths over raised their glasses in a silent toast. A group of firefighters at the counter gave him a respectful nod. A retired Marine in the corner stood up and snapped off a salute. Chuck returned it without missing a beat. He hadn't realized how much he needed this. After years of watching the world speed up, grow louder, grow shallower, he had begun to wonder if there was still a place for the kind of values he lived by. Loyalty, honor, humility. Tonight answered that question. The food arrived quickly. 2 giant plates piled high with thick, juicy steaks, runny eggs, and golden hash browns. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't plated with tweezers or sprinkled with edible flowers. It was hearty, honest, and absolutely perfect. Chuck took his first bite and let out a low grunt of appreciation. "Damn good steak," he said. Eddie, who was hovering nearby, positively beamed. Only the best for a real American hero. Word had spread by now, and though the patrons were respectful, a few approached for autographs and photos. Chuck obliged every one of them, posing for selfies with grandmothers, signing a firefighter's helmet, shaking hands with teenagers who had only heard of him through stories told by their dads. And through it all, Gordon watched with a satisfied smile. This was how it should be. Not fawning, not fame worship, just genuine, heartfelt respect for a man who had earned it the hard way. At one point, Eddie brought over a small wooden plaque and a marker. "Would you mind?" he asked, holding out shyly. "It's a little tradition we have." Legends signed the wall. Chuck took the marker without hesitation and carefully wrote, "To Eddie's Grill, where real respect still lives. Stay strong. Chuck Norris." The entire restaurant erupted into a round of applause. Not the kind demanded by some stage appearance, but the kind that rises up naturally when people are just damn happy to be part of a moment worth remembering. As they finished their meal, Gordon leaned in and said quietly, "I know tonight started rough, mate. But don't you ever doubt. Real recognizes real. Always will." Chuck nodded slowly, feeling something heavy lift off his shoulders. "You know," he said with a grin, "I might just make this my regular spot." Gordon laughed, raising his coffee mug in a mock toast. "To Eddie's Grill, then. Sanctuary of the lost art of respect." They clinked their mugs together, the simple sound cutting through the din of conversation and laughter around them. Outside, the night deepened. Hollywood's glitter might have dimmed, but inside Eddie's Grill, under the glow of buzzing neon and the scent of fresh coffee, Chuck Norris found something far more valuable than fame. A reminder that the spirit he carried hadn't been lost to time. It had just moved to places where people still knew how to recognize it. And in those places, Chuck Norris would always be a legend.